Okay, awesome. So let's go ahead and get started. Let me get my controls here. Okay, so agenda for today. So what we're going to be talking about is, of course, we're talking about PM interviews. And specifically, we're going to zoom in and talk a little bit about the technical aspects of product management interviews. And, we'll go through some sample questions. We'll talk about sort of like the questions behind the questions. I'll do a little bit of categorization of like, okay, I know I'm going to get some technical questions. What are the types of technical questions that are going to come up? So it's helpful to think about, what are those categories? And then we'll try and do a little interactive problem solving, on these technical questions themselves. So, heads up, I will call on some folks and ask for some folks, hey, what, if you got this question, how would you answer? We'll try not to put anyone on the spot too much. We can do sort of team discussion of how to answer a question, but I think the more interactive the session is, the better. We'll get more out of it. It'll be more enjoyable, right? We're all on a million Zoom calls anyways these days, and like ones where it's just one person talking get super bored. So the other thing related to that is, as I'm going through these slides, if you have questions, if anything isn't clear, please just either like send a message to the chat. I've got it up on my other screen, or just unmute yourself and just shout it out. Chances are, if you have a question, someone else is thinking the same thing. Then the last thing I will do before I jump into the material we've got here on the slides is actually just zoom out for one quick second and talk about PM interviews in general, because we're going to be talking specifically about the technical questions that may come up in PM interviews. But if you end up going through the PM interview process, and I think it was, her name isn't on screen anymore, but Disha, right, who must have gone through the PM interview process at Microsoft recently, you'll face a whole variety of different questions. Some will be like testing your abilities on, product sense and product design. Some will be testing your abilities on analytical issues and using metrics and data, things like that. Technical, of course, will come up. And then other things like just, how effective are you at communicating? And, are you, not necessarily, I don't want to, actually back up, are you basically leadership skills? I was going to say natural born leader, and I don't really like that term. So that's why I paused and backed up there. But there's a handful of different things that all these companies are going to be testing you on. We're going to really just narrow in and, be specifically focused on the technical aspect today. So any questions before I get started? Okay. I don't want to spend too much time on this. This is a quick bit about my background. I basically spent about 12 plus years now building and launching software products at a handful of different companies. I have seen the full gamut of different like scales of companies, from really large companies like Google to smaller public companies like Zynga, which went public during the time I was there, and then smaller startups like Flurry, which was about a 100-person startup before we got acquired, and my own company now, RocketBlocks, which is currently a handful of people, and is related directly to what we're talking about today. So for folks that aren't familiar, RocketBlocks is basically an online platform that helps candidates prepare for interviews. We handle a bunch of different types. Product management is, of course, one of them. Okay, so let's go ahead and jump in. Let's talk about what to expect. So first, I just want to go through some examples. Like what is a technical question that might come up in a PM interview look like? So this is sort of like a classic one that comes up. It's basically testing a little bit of like, hey, do you know what sort of like a core piece of technical infrastructure is that helps modern software products run? Like, what is an API? And do you know it well enough to explain that sort of complex topic to someone that probably doesn't have any technical background, like your grandfather or your grandma, or your friend that's an English major, something like that. So that's a classical question. That's a good example there. Does anyone watch Parks and Rec, by the way? Does anyone get the reference on screen?
Yes.
Okay. I'm glad there's at least one person that gets it. So this is like one of my favorite scenes from this movie. And this is basically after this character, Ron Swanson, learns for the first time what a cookie is, like a web browser cookie. And in response, basically like throws his computer out when he learns how much tracking happens. But the idea behind these types of questions is like, hey, here's a basic maybe not a basic concept, but here is a technical concept. How well can you explain it? Are you comfortable talking through it? Do you understand sort of nuance, and can you talk about it with other folks? Here's a second sort of more involved example. So again, I use another API example here to show you a little bit of like the range. Like both of these questions are ultimately about APIs, but one is, I would say, much more of an API sort of overview question, where this question puts a lot of context around it. So I'm actually going to read this question just so we're all on the same page here. It says, like, imagine that you've just logged into your LinkedIn account and you've landed on the homepage with your LinkedIn newsfeed prominently displayed in the center of the page. Walk us through the API response that the LinkedIn front end received and what it may have looked like to generate the screen that you see in front of yourself. Like, give us a sense of the rough structure of the API response, what key pieces of data may have been sent from the backend. So this is a much more like in-depth question. Again, similar concept, but it's asking you to think about, you know, APIs within the context of a specific product, and going a little deeper and starting to talk about, okay, like, you know, what type of data is in it? Maybe how is that data structured? That type of stuff. So it goes a little deeper into the type of discussion that you might have on the job if you were a product manager, like talking to your engineer about, say, like changing something in the LinkedIn newsfeed. Like, let's say you work at LinkedIn. That's like a very possible conversation you might have on the job. And so for that reason, when a PM interviewer is sitting down and trying to assess, like, hey, is, you know, Alex or Disha or Manas like a good candidate for this PM role, they might throw out a question like this and see if you can sort of think through those strokes and discuss it. Make sense? Okay. Any questions from anyone so far? I see a thumbs up and I see some nodding, so that seems good. Cool. Okay, let's do a third example. So this example, another technical question that might come up in product management interviews, different type of topic, like talking about the actual technical architecture, the product stack or tech stack, if you will, that a product is built on. So let's take a look at what this question is. This is a little more in depth. It's sort of like a technical case-y type of question. But basically this is saying, you know, Gmail is thinking about adding a new delayed send functionality, which would allow someone to schedule an email that he or she wrote to be delivered at some point in the future. If the product is approved by your group product manager for the quarter, you'll be the PM responsible for implementing it and launching it. Which key parts of the Gmail tech stack would require work to launch something like this? And you can assume that no work to support a feature like this has been done before. So if you think about this type of question, again, it's within the context of a particular feature, but the fact that it's Gmail is probably one of the least important parts of the question. Like, really, it's saying, like, hey, here's a piece of software you're familiar with. And if we want to make this type of change to it, can you help us think through what are the different technical components we'd actually have to change? Now, the good news is, for, I think, most of the folks on this call, a lot of people seem to have some sort of at least technical background. Like, I didn't hear anyone say they were like an English and history major. So, you know, thinking through a tech stack probably feels a little more natural, certainly to the folks that have CS background. And I would imagine that data science folks have exposure to this as well. But the idea here is, you know, you're really being asked to translate a feature idea into what pieces of work does that create for an actual team? What would they need to get done? What would that look like? And, you know, walking through that type of question. So again, this is another type of like common type of question that might come up in a PM interview to get you to sort of think through this. And again, discuss the types of, you know, this is sort of a reflection of the type of conversation you'd probably have on the job. Like, if you actually were a PM at Gmail and you wanted to build this feature, the process would start with you sitting down with the engineering team and thinking through, like, if we want to do this, what does it mean in terms of work that we need to do? Which is, especially in my opinion, a very good reason for asking something like this. And you're sort of mimicking that experience and trying to understand, does this person have the right level of technical detail to, you know, engage and work effectively with an engineering team? So I'm going to pause here for a second and ask, Does anyone notice, like, after looking through these three examples, does anyone notice anything common about the three technical question examples I've thrown out?
Well, I guess one commonality is that you're kind of organizing this whole project for this tech stack one. You're talking about how to actually improve a feature, and I believe the second one was something similar to that too. It was talking about how, um, I don't know, yeah, it was talking about how you'd actually design the page to actually take in API and kind of talking about the front end specs of things. So I
Yep.
think that's really the primary role of a PM if you really think about it, right? So.
Yeah, yeah. So I like what you're saying, and keep me honest here if I'm summarizing wrong, but I think the summary of what you're saying is these questions, in many cases, are based around sort of the intersection of product type work and technical work, which is
Yeah,
where
that's
like a
exactly it.
PM sits.
Hmm.
Any other observations from anyone about these questions?
There's no coding questions.
Yeah, so someone said I couldn't hear who it was. Was that Disha?
Yeah.
Yeah. So no coding questions. That is something I want to address. We'll talk about this a little later because I do think that is a category of technical questions, but increasingly they tend to come up less and less as a lot of companies have realized that like the ability of a PM to code is maybe not the most useful indicator of his or her success on the job. That being a product manager is so interdisciplinary and requires so many other skills that actually the ability to say, write, an if-then loop in Python, or, have written a bubble sort algorithm or something like that before is useful. Okay, let's move on. Oh, there's a GIF. I forgot about that. Okay, so what are interviewers looking for when they ask these questions? I sort of jumped the gun here and started talking about some of this already, but there's 4 key things that I'd like to highlight. Some of them bleed together a little bit, but the first, pretty concretely, the reason that companies are asking technical questions of PM candidates in interviews is almost always to understand if the candidate can communicate effectively with the engineering team, not to understand, like, is this person a great coder? Like, is this person going to write the best code we've ever seen? Like, that's not the point. That's not what you're going to do on the job. And really, it's asking you something technical to see how you can sort of discuss and communicate around those topics with the intent of figuring out if we put this person on the job, if we put, Manas or Disha or Alex on the job, are they going to be able to work effectively with our engineering team? The corollary to that is if you cannot communicate effectively with engineering teams, so I've moved on to the second point here, you almost certainly won't be able to build trust with them. And if you can't build trust with an engineering team, it becomes extremely difficult to do the job of a product manager, because a lot of your core interactions on a day-to-day basis will be working with the engineering team to come up with feature ideas, spec those feature ideas, get them built, get them debugged, get them launched, and debug and triage whatever going on in production for the products and features you're responsible for. It just takes a whole ton of communication, and within that, like, earning trust and building trust with your team. And the team needs to know that, like, the engineering team, needs to know that their PM, like, if they tell him or her something, that the person is sort of going to understand it enough and understand the right components and ask follow-up questions and sort of engage. If not, that's sort of how that trust gets built. So that's like the second key thing. The third thing is, this is, I think, directly evident by that Gmail type question we were looking at, which is if someone said, if a conversation is happening that's sort of at the product layer where it's like, hey, we want to build feature X, or we want to, think about launching this new product in this new market. Is a PM going to be able to take and translate something from a product idea or a product conversation into the technical implications of that? And it doesn't mean that they need to go, again, like write the code to do that. They don't need to go write that algorithm, but they need to understand, like, if we're thinking about doing X in the product, what are the technical implications? Does that mean that we need, to bring on more backend engineers because we're going to be doing a bunch of like compute heavy stuff, and like, we just need a different team for that? Or, we need to talk to this other team in the company that manages this API because we're going to need to be able to grab certain pieces of information from it, et cetera. And then the last thing, does discussing technical topics make the candidate like anxious? Like, you all, for folks that are pursuing product management, are in a good bucket, especially the folks on this call that are CS majors, because there's a lot of folks that want to get into the career path that don't have that background. And so even though you don't need to code, and I want to be pretty explicit about that, it is not like a requirement in my mind to be a successful PM. There is this challenge of like, how do you prove that you're going to be able to work with engineers without having that background? And so for all of you, data science, CS, those are great backgrounds for getting into product management, because you probably have enough of the technical sort of fluency. You won't be nervous, anxious discussing these type of topics, especially if you put in a little bit of practice.
So I had a quick question.
Yeah.
So based on what you said, what I'm getting is that you also have to have influence without authority, which is one of the main goals of what a PM does as well. And it's kind of like earning the trust of their like technical counterparts, or whether it's like other design teams or other teams as well. So could you talk more about that, and like what the interviewer might be looking for in that case?
Yeah, so you're absolutely right. Like the job of a product manager, especially at the entry levels, you are almost certainly going to have no one reporting to you. However, like you're supposed to sort of influence and work with the engineering team. So, being able to influence the team without formal authority is critical. And typically how interviewers will try and assess this is they're going to try and understand if, like, if they let's take the Gmail question, for example. If they ask you that question and you start talking through it, like, can you articulate and provide like a logical, well-structured and sort of clear rationale for, why you think you need to change X? Or if you are a little confused about, like, if we need to change X or Y, do you have a clear series of sort of questions that you can ask that are going to yield like the right type of information that you need to get an answer? And being able to break down the problems in that way, and then either say like, okay, here's what we need, or here's what we need to learn, I think is often what folks want to see, because that's the type of like conversation that becomes productive in a product team, and will allow you to like basically A, earn trust, and then B, be able to influence after you have that trust. Because if you're just like the PM who's like running around being like, we need to do X, and you have no rationale for it, or it's like, we need to do Y, and the reason, you have a reason, but it's like, because I say so, like that type of PM will lose a lot of credibility very quickly. And you'd be surprised how many times people in interviews will sort of, usually probably not on purpose, but they will indicate that they might operate that way by just throwing statements out and not sort of defending, or not explaining the logic of why they're thinking that way, or what other things they might think to check in the organization, or pieces of data to look at, et cetera, to verify if that actually makes sense. Does that help answer your question?
Yep, got it. Thank you.
Cool.
I also have a question for your final point on this slide before
Yep.
you. So if you don't come from a comp sci or data science background, do you sort of have a way or like any resources to recommend that, other majors do get familiar with technical jargon and things like that?
Yeah, so I do have a few things. So the first is going to feel a little bit like a cop-out, but like I was in the same position myself. Like my formal majors from University of Virginia, where I did my undergrad, are economics and history. Like I had no actual technical training, so I had to sort of cobble together things, teach myself HTML and SQL and PHP and whatever. I think there's a handful of topics that are really useful for people that don't have a technical background to to brush up on and learn some basics on, because it gives them the right building blocks to then at least start having discussions. And a lot of those things are like, the basics of how modern web products get built. So like understanding like what an API is, understanding like what a database is and what role that plays. And like the difference between like what's the front end and what's the back end. How does that play out in say like a web app versus a mobile app? How does that all fit together in a quote unquote tech stack like we were talking about? One way to learn some of this stuff is RocketBlocks does cover a lot of this stuff explicitly because I think it is important. And there is a ton of stuff out there. So we try and spend a lot of time curating it. So we're saying like, look, here's sort of what you need to know if you're coming at this for the first time. And then here's questions, basically interview questions and drills that will help you test whether you've learned that or not. The other key place I think that you can learn and pick up some of this stuff is, it's, I would say is like there are courses out there that will give you some like introduction to, and there's like a lot of introduction to coding classes, but I don't actually know that that's where I would recommend starting because they tend to go too deep without really helping you understand how everything fits together. So I might actually, the other source I would recommend is like sit down with a technical friend, like sit down with someone else in this club and, pull out like your favorite app or a common app that both of you know, like pull out Uber and say, okay, like try and understand from them, like walk through the whole process of like everything that happens in the Uber app and try and ask them what's actually happening in the background. Because what like the type of technical knowledge you want as a PM is how do I go from an idea to being able to talk about here's the components and like the architecture and the things that we need to put in place to have this product come to life. You don't actually need to go write the code to do it. And so for people that aren't technical, but are trying to become technical, I think, just saying and going and picking up a single coding language sometimes can be useful, but it will take you sort of deeper into minutia there that may not actually get you the end goal you want.
Okay, thanks. That's really useful.
So yeah, to summarize, I would say two ways. One, sit down with a technical friend and like try and walk through how a product works. Like try and just pick a software product and dissect the whole thing and understand what's happening.
A study buddy.
Yeah, study buddy. And then, RocketBlocks is another thing that has like a technical concepts track that will introduce you to a lot of those topics and try and do that for you. Any other questions?
I think that's a really cool idea in the future for us to actually do. Having like a kind of like a mini size workshop for, I don't know, where you guys could have a study buddy. I don't know. What do you guys think? Yeah?
Sounds like a great idea.
Yeah.
Cool. Himanshu, you're back. Oh, thank God. Okay, we were missing you, buddy.
I'm sorry, I was
Please.
at the center.
Yeah, no worries, man.
Okay, so let's talk about technical questions and categorize them. So we did a few examples, like what do these things look like? Let's actually look at some of the common categories that come up. So there's general questions. I think the very first question we looked at was another example of a general technical question in my mind, like what's an API? Explain how they work. Another very common like canonical question is like, how does the internet work? This question actually, and typically people ask this, like what happens if I type Google into my address bar or Yelp or something like that? And they want you to walk you through the steps of like how your internet browser actually produces like the Yelp homepage. This is very similar to that exercise I was just talking about like sit down with a friend that's technical and ask them like, what the hell happens when I like open the Uber app? Like what's going on? Like, how does this map appear? How do these cars show up on it? That type of stuff. Okay, second category is, nice. Someone said I was actually asked this in a PM interview. Is that about the how the internet works question, Dhruv?
Yeah.
Yeah, that question comes up all the time. Like if you go through PM interviews at like at least 3 companies, there's like, I would say 95% chance someone asks you that question. APIs, we talked about this before, but like Some of them can be super general questions, but more specific ones like, tell me how an API might be involved with Uber Eats, or like, how would an API be used in the LinkedIn newsfeed or the Facebook newsfeed? Or, do you think DoorDash has APIs? Like, tell me how they might be used. Like, just like trying to get your sense of like, do you understand how these products fit together? Same questions often in terms of databases, but there's a bunch of different flavors here. It might be like, hey, like, if we want to build this new feature, what type of data do you think we need to store to support it? Or, hey, we have this type of data stored in our database today, and we want to do Y. Is that possible with the data we have? Do we need some sort of new data? That type of stuff. Tech stacks. So this is a classic question that cuts across a lot of these topics. This is like the Gmail question I asked. We want to launch this new feature. Maybe it's, let's say it is, well, let's use a Gmail example, scheduling feature. What parts of our entire code base do we need to touch? Can you walk me through that process? Then increasingly common category is machine learning, data science type topics. Like as this gets baked into more and more products, you'll see this coming up in PM interviews more and more. So it might be things like, hey, walk me through the basics of what machine learning is, or tell me how you use machine learning in this product area, or pick your favorite product and tell me an ML feature you could build. Or it might be something like, actually getting into like model tuning details, like what's the difference between precision and recall? How would you think about that? When might you tune for one versus the other? That type of stuff. Okay. A few other types. So good news is for this audience, I give this presentation to some MBAs as well that often don't have technical backgrounds, and they get really terrified by this type of stuff. But there are these categories of questions like algorithms, data structures, maybe more detailed system design questions, where some companies will take a PM candidate deeper into a technical stuff and actually, ask them to discuss this. It'd be really hard to probably give a good answer to what's a hash table or tell us about big O notation or that type of stuff if you are not technical and have never studied that, certainly. This type of stuff does come up. And I would say for all of you that have a CS background, maybe be a little more cognizant that because you have a CS major on your resume, people may even be more likely to ask this to you to just sort of see like, hey, like, did they actually learn the right stuff in their CS major? And then the other thing I will say about this is certain companies have a preference for more technical PMs. And when you are interviewing with those companies, you are more likely, not guaranteed, but you are more likely to see some of these questions. Like Google does prefer more technical folks as their PMs. And so, when you get your interview panel information, if you interview with Google in the future, for every PM, there's typically one interview that's going to be focused on technical topics. Now, the bad news is that Google has a ton of variance in what that interviewer is going to ask you about. Some interviewers may sit down and ask you to like design an algorithm and expect like you to do some pseudocode on the board. Others might sit down and just ask you like, tell me about an API, explain it to your grandfather, that type of stuff. And then a lot of other companies, are probably going to require, a lot of other companies are less technical in the PM interview process than Google is, but certainly some are more and some are on the same point. That's another company that tends to prefer a lot of pretty technical PMs because their product is incredibly technical and most of their customers, their direct customers are engineers, is a company like Stripe. So know if you're going into certain companies and talking to companies that have a strong preference for super technical PMs, that you might be a little more likely to see some of these type of questions. And what I would say is you can always ask the recruiter in advance, what type of questions, what type of skills should I be ready to demonstrate? You can even ask point blank, how technical does the team like their PM candidates to be? Can you give me an idea of the type of questions they might ask? They may not give you an answer, but it never hurts to ask, right? And it's a great question to ask the recruiter. Okay, any questions on this? I saw someone else saying they actually got the elevator question as well. I've been personally asked that question in an interview. It's another one of, I don't know why, but it just sort of seems to be like a canonical design question, system design question that comes up.
Yeah, I was asked a question. It was definitely something I wasn't prepared for.
Well, now you know. Okay. So let's do some brainstorming together and talk about some of these questions. And it says chat box on the screen, but since we're a small group, I think we can just sort of, folks can shout out. But let's go back to that first question we talked about. API basics, explain an API to your grandfather. Does anyone want to take a stab at doing this?
Sure, it's just a way for computers to communicate with each other.
Okay. And why do computers need to communicate with each other?
To get data.
Okay. And what's like an example of this happening?
Kind of like an HTTP GET request, right? When you just want to display information on your screen, you'd hit an endpoint and then you'd get, I don't know, a response via like a JSON, things like that.
Okay. But what if I'm your grandfather and I don't know what GET is,
I was
and I don't know
gonna
what
say that.
HTTP is, and I don't know
I
what
forgot the
JSON is?
question, yeah. Well, hopefully he has master's in CS. So I don't.
Remember, I'm a history major. I only know about like World War
shoot,
II
yeah.
history and supply and demand curves.
In my head, just like a those trends when people started explaining things in like the monkey explanation, monkey have banana, monkey explain banana to monkey, kind of like that. I don't know, it just popped in my head.
Okay. Does anyone else want to take a stab?
I
at
don't
this
know,
one?
man. Yeah.
I could try.
Go for it.
So basically, if I was explaining what an API was to my grandfather, I'd start off by saying APIs. I'd give him the full form. So I don't remember the full form now. Application Program Interface.
Oh, did you
There
give
it
him the
is.
full
You got
form
it.
if you don't know? Okay, good.
That's step one. What's the basics? That's a good place to start.
Right. And so then I'd explain so essentially what this is used for is for different parts of any software you're using to get data. For example, if Facebook wanted to know what friends are on your list, it would use an API, the Facebook API, to get a list of all your friends.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead.
I was saying, I think you guys are overcomplicating it. Like my grandpa doesn't know what software is. Like, I don't think they'd get like, I got asked in an interview once, like explain recursion to a 5-year-old. And how I just said is like in preschool, when you're teaching 5-year-olds, or I guess kindergarten, like what month is it? You start with January. Is it January? No. Okay. Is it February? No. Is it March? No. Is it April? Yes. Okay, now we know what month it is. I feel like it's got to be like really easy.
So that's a good point that Disha makes. And then the answer, the second answer that came out there, I couldn't actually see who was speaking, but pulling in an example of Facebook in this case, because it's a good way to bring things to life, right? Because like you're probably like most people are on Facebook these days. So like the concept of like, hey, I load my Facebook page and it says I have 50 friends on my profile. You're taking something that a lay person is going to have some reference point to, and then connecting it is really important. And then to Disha's point, like the simpler the better. Going back to something we talked about in the beginning, right, is the purpose of these questions is not to hear you like sort of flex on the most technical thing you can talk about, but it's sort of, can you take a technical topic and explain it sort of simply and eloquently, which is often is an indicator that you understand it very deeply if you can find a simple way to explain it. But that's usually what they're looking for. And the other reason that this is important is if you think about, and I'm going to bring in a little more context here, but like I've been talking a lot about, hey, they're going to ask you these technical questions to see if you're sort of technical enough that you can communicate effectively with engineers. And that is absolutely 100% true. Like as a PM, You'll probably work on like a product team, and you'll have, like somewhere between like 5 or 10 engineers you work with. You'll need to talk to all of them on a given day. But the other aspect of product management is that you have marketers, salespeople, designers, maybe ops, support people, all sorts of other people, legal folks potentially, that you're going to be dealing with in the course of like getting your product out, launching it, building it, et cetera. And all of those people, to some extent, at certain points, are going to need to understand certain technical details of the product, but they are not going to be technical themselves in most cases. You're like, lead sales contact is probably not going to be technical. Your legal person is probably not going to be technical. And they are going to rely, and the success of the product to some extent will rely on the PM's ability to take these technical concepts and explain them in a way that those non-technical people can grasp so that they can do their jobs effectively, right? Like if you've built some really cool product with some awesome, like amazing ML stuff, and it does all this like wizardry, but your marketer doesn't understand anything of what's happened, and all he can think of is like, we did some ML, that's not going to be a super like compelling marketing message, right? So like you need to be able to find a way to take all of that complex detail and wrap it up in a way that shows like some insight and some, compelling angles for your marketer to understand that he or she can do their job with. And same thing with sales and legal, et cetera. Okay. Let's go on to the second example. Does anyone want to take a stab at like talking through this question? If you got it in the interview, we can also team solve it. Like if folks want to just throw out, well, you definitely have to change this, we can do this one as a team.
Are we talking about it as if we're coming up with it from scratch?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, I mean, we don't have to build Gmail from scratch, but we're like thinking about,
No,
okay,
just
build...
just sending in the emails delayed,
Yeah.
right? Okay.
The first thing I'd think of is the UI, what we have to add or change to the existing sending email UI to allow for scheduling.
Okay, cool. And tell me, like, so we got to change the UI. That's cool. I agree. Like, what do we need to do? Like, do we need a button? Should we just make the UI all green? Like, what are you thinking then?
So it would be an additional button.
Okay.
Like, or when you're hitting send, you could have an extra drop down at send where you could be like send later instead of just send.
Okay.
And then send later would prompt you with the modal asking for time and date.
Okay, cool. I like that. That seems like a reasonable thing to do.
Yeah, I'd also imagine that would kind of be consistent with the UI design of the Google Calendar. That way it's if you have like another theme, right? Like you mentioned, if you just have another like green button, that's not really going to be really consistent with everything that's been going on the web page.
Okay, cool. I like that. We're thinking about keeping things consistent so it doesn't, Gmail doesn't look like a hodgepodge after we launch this feature. That makes sense. What other things do you think, like what other areas of the tech stack do we need to consider updating to support this change?
I don't know if this would be like right or not, but I was just wondering if you could integrate this with Google Calendar, because you could just set a time and a date based on, and just like integrate that into your calendar. Like calendars have reminders as well, so just like set a time date. I don't know if it would be feasible or not.
Okay, got it. So you want to pull in some of the UI around GCal and potentially integrate that. What if we move past the UI stuff? Like if we're gonna support this feature where you can now send an email, but it doesn't actually get sent when you click send later or whatever. Like what else do we need to think about doing?
I think one other thing is that on the backend side of things, so right now, if we don't have a send later feature, anything that you send gets sent immediately. So there's no timestamp on it.
Yeah.
If you have a send later feature, we want to introduce a timestamp so that that can be added to the queue. And then we can create like like we can add a pipeline or a component to our server or to our database so that that timestamp can be recorded, and then that can show up. We can show that to the user later on.
Yeah, exactly. So you hit on a bunch of good points there. And one thing I'll say is when you go through this type of stuff, that if you can call out the structure and the components you're highlighting, you did a really good job. You actually touched on a bunch of different things there. I think if this were an actual interview and you're calling it out, if you could have structured and said, okay, like we got to do this, we got to do this, and we got to do this. So like two pretty concrete things I heard there was the first is like, we need to save an additional piece of information at the very least, which is the timestamp of when should this email be sent. We know it's not supposed to be sent now, but when, right? So we need some sort of timestamp of when to send this. And then the other key thing I heard you say, I think you called it like a pipeline or a queue or something like that, but you were basically saying, look, we need some sort of process that I presume if I'd asked you more about it, you're gonna say, you know, we need some sort of process to loop over on some cadence, right? And say, oh yeah, like we have this email that has this timestamp and now it is this timestamp, we got to send that thing, right? Like, because if you think about the current system, that process doesn't exist. It's just some user clicks send and Gmail just like fires that email off.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's what I meant, like some kind of a process so that you can track that later on. And you also want users to know what kind of emails they're sending when, so that that can be added to like either the server or a database or something else.
Yeah. Cool. So I think, so you guys talked about a bunch of good things there. One thing I just want to pause and like, as you're thinking about this type of question, especially for the folks that maybe feel less technical on this call. I know there was at least one person that said like, you know, what if you don't have that background? But even maybe for the folks that are like data science that maybe don't spend all day like building, you know, like an actual like software system or like a full web app or something like that. I think this question is a good way to illuminate the fact that if you think about the discussion we had there, like we were actually mostly talking about like common sense things that you're trying to get accomplished based off a product idea. And it wasn't like super technical. Like we didn't get into discussing like, oh, we're going to need, you know, this particular type of database or, you know, this type of database, it's got to be Mongo or whatnot. Like that's not the purpose of these type of questions. But what is important is like the sort of what I would call relatively like common sense insight that like, hey, if we're going to send these emails in the future, we need to store something that says when in the future is it going to be sent. And that's the type of stuff that you want to pick up on and be thinking about is like, what are the things that we need to do? And as a non-technical person approaching these type of questions, if you can get the right logic, even if you don't know all the specific terminology, like even if you don't know the word like timestamp, which is generally probably how like an engineer would refer to like a Unix timestamp or something like that. If you say like, hey, we need to like save the date and time so that we know when to send it in the future. Like if I were an interviewer, I would be like, great, yeah, like that's what we need to do. Like we don't need to quibble about what particular format it's going to be. And I don't care about that. Like the engineering team ultimately will probably make that decision anyways, because maybe they'll want to store it in seconds or maybe they'll want to store it in milliseconds. Like, I don't know. Different teams have different preferences. And like that is more of an engineering consideration than say a product consideration. Although there's some areas where that would overlap. But I think this is a good question to sort of illustrate that stuff, that even though you're talking about a tech stack and how a technical product would fit together, the area where a PM sort of can add a lot of value and where interviewers are going to be trying to assess you on is, are you figuring out the right components and the things that need to be done? And you can actually describe most of those with fairly simple language. It doesn't actually need to be complex. And sometimes it's better to be able to describe it in simple language rather than like going super detailed into, you know, nitty-gritty things. But, you know, occasionally you'll get some interviewers that want to dive into that. And usually they will ask you for those. And then you can, you know, if you have that depth, you can offer that up. Any questions on that?
A quick question would be, how important would showing impact on this issue would be? So say I talk about all the UI components, all the backend components, all of that. Then one other important aspect is like showing how important it can be for the user. So that's what I was thinking, that we could like show the impact and how it could be useful to the user, and that we could like use that at the end while explaining things.
Yeah, so that's a really good point. This particular question is phrased so it's sort of like, you tell me about like what's going to change in the tech stack. But certainly if you got this question in an interview, you're never going to be dinged by saying like, oh, like I'm excited to talk about that. Like, let's jump into the tech stack. One question before we get into that, like, have we already sort of locked down that like this solves like a real use case and a pain point for users? And then like, you could discuss that up front or at least ask about it. And they might say, yeah, we know it's a pain point. So let's just talk about how to build it. And then on the backside of like, once you've talked about the tech stuff, there's like, yeah, like, how do we know it's working once we've launched it? How are we going to measure that? And there's no harm in proposing, especially if you have time, like here's, the metric I would look at, or a handful of metrics I would look at to see if users are really adopting this. So for example, like if I were the PM in charge of launching delayed sends, one thing I might use as a metric to track whether it's being useful is like, after you roll it out, what percentage of emails are actually sent on a delayed send basis? And you'd have to do some thinking about what's the right metric to expect there. What does success look like? But certainly like 0% probably is not success. Why did we spend all this time building this? If it's like 0 or 0.1% of sends are actually sent on a delayed basis, and expecting it to be 50% probably is like crazy as well, because most people probably just want to send most emails right off the bat. But like maybe it's like 5%, like hitting some metric like that makes sense, and we can have that discussion and think about it, and maybe the team has some perspective, etc. But very good point. Never hurts to quantify and try and put metrics around what you're building and how you would measure it, so if it's actually having the impact that you intend.
Got it. Thank you.
Cool. Okay. Where did my mouse go? Oh, that's why. Okay. So I forgot about this slide. This is an example I put together of just a bunch of the things I would call out if I got that particular question. So I started with some assumptions and then talked through, a bunch of the stuff that you all ultimately called out. What's the design look like? What's the front end look like? I broke down mobile versus web, back end. We need some continuous cadence for scheduled emails. And then what are the changes to the database as well? Okay. We have 4 minutes left, so I'm going to try. There's not a ton left. A few key things I think to think about when you are preparing for interviews, and this goes for the technical aspect of product management interviews, but all aspects of the interview that we were talking about earlier. So whether it's product sense, analytics questions, the leadership behavioral stuff, just communication. The key thing I would start with is do your research online. Do some research about like what does this company like to ask. There's places like Glassdoor, Blind, etc., where you can get sort of lists of, not lists, but like insights into what questions these type of companies have asked in the past. You can get a sense. You can talk to some friends, maybe people in industry at those companies. It's helpful context. I don't think you want to get the questions that have been asked in the past and try and memorize particular answers to them because they're going to come up again. Like sometimes you'll get lucky, but that's not really the point. You want to try and just get a sense of like, what are they asking about? Are they asking a lot of like coding, the deeper technical questions? Or are they asking just like sort of basic technical questions? That gives you an idea of sort of what level to be thinking about. Second big thing is talk to your allies. So I mentioned this earlier, but like recruiters are super helpful in the interview process. They are generally on your team. And what I mean by that is, the recruiter is not going to make the decision about whether you get hired or not. They're just helping shepherd you through the process. So they're a person that you can ask questions to that, what should I expect? How should I think about preparing, these type of things? They may have tips and information there that can be useful to you. And they are, in many cases, incentivized to get you an offer as well. Like once they start working with you, once they've like vetted you and are bringing you through the process, they want you to get hired. It is beneficial to them because they will get paid more if you get hired in most cases. They get bonused off that. So your incentives are aligned. And when your incentives are aligned, that's like a very powerful thing. So that's great. So use your recruiters. A lot of people, maybe not a lot of people, but enough people are like rude to recruiters and don't treat them very well because they see them as like people that are like lower on the totem pole. That's a huge mistake. Don't do that. They have a ton of info, and if they like you, they're more likely to give you more insights. So treat recruiters well, because that's a good just thing to treat other people well in general, and because like it may win you some useful information. And then the last thing is practice. Like all of these questions that we're talking about, this stuff gets better, it gets easier to do the more you go through the motions. Some of this stuff is a little unnatural talking about it for the first time. One of the challenges, especially that folks like yourself that often come from technical backgrounds, is when someone asks you a technical question, it's easy to get stuck in the weeds, right? It's really easy because you know that topic really, really well. Like on the API question earlier, we were talking about like GET requests and HTTP and JSON responses and things like that. Those are all true and they're right. And like that is part of like what happens with an API. But if someone's asking you to explain it to someone that doesn't, like they want you to come at a different level. And so practicing and going through the motions will help a lot. It really, really helps to just like say like, oh, give me a technical question and let me go through the motions. And then let me like look at what a good answer looks like. Or, give me a product design question. Same thing for product design questions. It probably won't surprise anyone in this call, given that, like I run a company that does this, but like that's basically what RocketBlocks is built to do. We're essentially trying to provide a digital gym for interviews so that you can go through the motions and all the different skills that matter and build those skills. But there's, you don't have to use RocketBlocks to do this. There's a million different ways to practice these questions. If you sort of know what to expect, just going through the questions, maybe, sit down with friends, drill each other on them, go through questions, ask for feedback, etc. But the bottom line is like practicing will help a lot. When I was in an undergrad, when I was in your shoes, I remember the first interviews I went into, I just sort of thought that like you go into an interview and you get a job or not based off like how smart you were. I didn't really think that any sort of practice would make a difference. And I realized like pretty quickly that like is not true. That interviews are sort of like a weird beast in and of themselves, and certainly like your raw talent is going to be a factor in them, but the more you practice, like the easier it makes it. So that's the last thing I'll say. Yeah, this is just an example from the actual RocketBlocks product, and I will send this deck to you so that you have it afterwards. And we will also, I was like running late and my computer crashed right before I jumped into this meeting. So I didn't get time to do it, but we'll put together a coupon code for your club as well. If you're interested in using a product that will give you 25% off. So you'll have that, and we'll make that available to you. And I have a few more minutes until I've got to run. So if there's any last questions, comments, anything like that, happy to answer them.
I don't have a question, but I just think that you touched a lot of really, really good bases. And for the people who just weren't able to make it, I'm glad this is being recorded for them. So yeah, thank you so much. But if anyone else has any questions, feel free. The floor is open.
Yeah, I think you covered everything. This was so helpful.
I'm glad it was helpful.
All right.
Okay.